Chapter 8 focuses on the policy fields developed within the framework of what the Lisbon Treaty calls the external action of the EU. These policy fields, which are discussed in detail in the chapter of the book, are trade, association and cooperation agreements, enlargement, development cooperation, sanctions and humanitarian aid. The EU's external action policies, which all have economic foundations, are at the basis of the EU's power, and they constitute major instruments for conducting and implementing foreign policy. The power potentially emanating from these policy fields becomes clear if we look at the fact that the EU is among the largest trading blocs in the world and one of the main trading partners for many third countries. If we look at the fact that the EU and its member states are combined the world's largest donor of official development assistance and also the most important donor of humanitarian aid, and that the EU can rely on a vast network of international agreements, trade and cooperation agreements or association agreements with many other regions and countries in the world.
Taken together, the policy fields included in the EU's external action provide an extensive toolbox for the EU's foreign policy to pursue traditional foreign policy objectives such as conflict prevention or promotion of human rights, to develop a comprehensive structural foreign policy towards other regions in the world, to develop and support positive dynamics in third countries or regions, for example through financial support, trade concessions or upgrades in cooperation and association agreements, and finally, it also provides a toolbox for sanctions, for sanctioning governments of third countries, for example, through economic sanctions, arms embargoes, or targeted sanctions against their leaders. In this video, we will focus on two dimensions of this external action: trade and development policy.
First of all, trade. The EU is a powerful trade actor. Not only because it is among the world's largest trading blocs, but also because it has exclusive competences on trade policy. The EU indeed has a genuine common commercial policy. This means that individual member states don't negotiate their trade agreements with third countries, but that it is the European Commission that has the sole responsibility of conducting trade negotiations on behalf of the whole EU, based on a mandate from the Council and to be ratified by the Council and the European Parliament afterwards. However, although the EU is largely a single actor in international trade, it does not make it a monolith. Member states, which can via the Council influence the EU's trade policy, have different economic interests, and they also differ in their view on whether and when trade-related interests should or should not dominate over foreign policy interests, such as promoting democracy and rule of law, and development objectives, such as poverty reduction.
And this brings us to the relationship between trade and foreign policy. Trade policy is important for the EU's foreign policy as it provides essential instruments for foreign policy and for pursuing non-trade policy objectives. However, the EU and its member states always have to balance their foreign policy objectives with their trade interests, and these are not at all always compatible. They will often give indeed priority to trade interests and other related interests such as the supply of energy from third countries. Moreover, the EU's trade policy, but also other policy fields such as agricultural policy, can also undermine foreign policy objectives, as these policies can negatively affect the economy of third countries and indirectly also their political structures and their societies.
The second external action policy field that we will briefly discuss in this video is development cooperation. The EU's competences on development cooperation are different than those on trade. The EU and its member states have in the field of development cooperation so-called parallel competences, which means that the EU's development policy and that of the 27 member states exist in parallel to each other. These 27 plus 1 development policies can complement and reinforce each other, but that is not necessarily and not always the case. Consistency between the EU level and the national level is thus not always guaranteed. And just like in trade policy, different views can also exist among member states, but also within and among institutions, about the relationship between traditional development policy priorities, poverty reduction, and other policy objectives.
And questions that arise in this context are, for example, should the eradication of poverty always be the primary objective of the EU's development policy? Or can it be linked to expectations with regard to a third country's respect for human rights and democracy? Is it acceptable that development cooperation is instrumentalized to advance the EU's interest in other policy areas such as migration or energy or security? And in this context, can development assistance be made conditional to the compliance of a third country with return and readmission policies of the EU? The relationship between foreign policy, the EU's external action, and what is labeled as the external dimension of internal policies, such as migration policy, is discussed in chapter 9 of our book and in the next video.